Okay, thank you very much. Professor Fazeli has very generously allowed Armineh and myself to present, so he must trust us very deeply. It's a delight to present today, so both Armineh and myself are very grateful to the Iran Heritage Foundation for this opportunity, and also to John Curtis for anticipating our interest in this. And I will point out that Professor Fazeli and myself worked at Tappeh Sialk in 2008 and 2009, although this is my 20th anniversary of when you first took me to visit the site. So I'm very grateful to Professor Fazeli for that. The field work on which I'll present was supported by BIPS, supported by the British Academy, ICAR, IHTO, and also Tehran University. So we are very grateful to those funding bodies. And of course, the context for our work is the interest overall in the archaeology, the prehistory of the Tehran plain as well as the Central Plateau, and the pioneering work in the 30s by Eric Schmidt, and on the top left you have the aerial photographs of Cheshmeh Ali in the early days, and then a rather unloved Cheshmeh Ali bottom right before Nazar Pazuki actually transformed the place into a paradise. And that's where, of course, Professor Fazeli first started working with Dr. Saraf in 1997. And of course, the other pioneers are those of Tehran University and Professor Negaban, working at Zagay in Gazvin, again pioneering the prehistory of the Tehran plain. 1997, and you can see top right in the middle is Dr. Saraf there with the team from 97. And of course, it was around this work that Hassan based his pioneering PhD, actually returning to the work of Eric Schmidt and trying to bring in an absolute chronology, trying to move away from relative comparisons and actually move to absolute dating. Between 2003 and 2008, we undertook a survey within the Kashan plain, really, as we've heard in the previous presentation, looking at occupation through time from the montane down onto the Piedmont, and there another picture of a camel for those of you with interests in the desert, trying to look at the socio-economic transformations which occurred during that time. And the survey conducted by students from University of Tehran, University of Bradford as well, looking for evidence from the Sasanian through to the prehistoric period. And one of the most significant sites is, of course, Tepe Pardis, which, as you can see on top right, is anything but a paradise. What you can see in the foreground are bricks, because the prehistoric site was busily being turned into bricks to feed the growth of Garchak. Pardis, the excavations at Pardis produced some phenomenal evidence of early ceramic manufacture. There you can see bottom left is the trench, the initial trench cut down from a bit of Parthian occupation at the top. But as you can see with the radiocarbon dates, and these weren't just one radiocarbon dates, but multiple ones, evidence pushing back to 5000 BC, and also extremely well-preserved kilns. So top left is actually one of the areas where the kiln wall has collapsed. So the kilns were upwards of 1.5, perhaps even 2 meters high. So phenomenal. And equally phenomenal was the recovery of this rather bewildering round terracotta object on the left, which proved to have a sheep bone as a pivot. It is the world's oldest pottery wheel, and it dates to some 4,900. The bottom right is it sitting in Dr. Nokande's museum there as part of the display. Also significant about Pardis was because so much quarrying had been undertaken for clay, it actually gave this phenomenal sequence into the ancient landscapes. And with that, also evidence of both rivers, but also artificial irrigation. And also it shows how much is probably hidden below the overburden at such sites. Now, in a way, the work by Dr. Fazeli and the team working with him was key to try and bring an absolute chronology. And the chronology stretches across the central plateau. And also the chronology has a series of sort of, in a way, interfaces. And one of the interfaces is the interface between, of course, the Cheshmeh Ali and the lower levels at Sialk. And before the return to Sialk in 2008, actually very little understanding of the earliest levels of occupation, so the question marks, how early was it? So Dr. Fazeli was very keen, so he translated the team from the Central Plateau, from the area of Varamin down to Kashan for 2 seasons. You've heard much about Kashan, but it's worth showing some slides of the Bazari Bazorg, top left, some of the earlier illustrations, and there it sits on one of the most significant of the communication networks. And of course, much of the ancient city, the ice house, and the merchants' houses are still preserved, including the great city wall. And indeed, the merchants' houses are now a place of very fine ice cream, also we found. And also, after a day of digging, the Bargi Fin was an extremely relaxing place. And of course, its significance being at the mouth of the Kanat from the mountains that we heard described in the last presentation. So the reason we came back to Sialk was to provide an absolute chronology and to follow up this key stepping stone in the chronology of the Central Plateau set by Grishman. So Grishman, as we've heard much about the southern mound, and then in the top left is the northern mound, and his deep trenches, which at the time were phenomenal, and actually the railway there on the bottom right, of which there's much ballast still lying around. Those were the days when one could afford to have hundreds of archaeologists. And of course, from his deep excavations, which have stood the test of time, the sequences that were found there are core to the sequence for the Central Plateau. And also, as has been presented in the last lecture, very much the anticipation, the predictions made by Grishman have influenced later scholars. And partly we came back because of his identification that the site, almost without interruption, is the progress for the Iranian plateau. And of course, the Sialk Reconsideration Project, 1999 to 2004, we've heard presentations, was pioneering, and the discovery of the ziggurat. Our own work took over in 2008, 2009, returning to Sialk North, with an aim of actually giving an absolute date. So trying to see how from Grishman's trenches we could produce an absolute chronology. This is Grishman's section going down 15, 16 meters, and there on the left is the recuts section excavated in 2000 and 2009, a 16-meter deep section. I just thought I'd give you some slides on logistics in terms of how one actually approaches a trench like that. lots of scaffolding, and we also, Armineh taught us how to use climbing harnesses as well to ensure that at that time Bradford University's health and safety was not overrun. And then at the bottom for the deep sondage, and of course the difficulties of ensuring that the material coming out is actually kept separately. So quite a dramatic piece of work. This is the output, Trench 2, of Grishman's work, and these are the upper levels, and they have produced very much a confirmation of Grishman's earlier work. So, for example, he identified the appearance of mud brick. Sure enough, there we have mud brick on the right. The mortuary practices and their changes, of which we've heard a little earlier. But key to it is the radiocarbon sequence. So this is the upper part of the radiocarbon sequence down to where the horizontal pole is, which takes us back to about 5000 BC. And then Grishman, at the bottom of his trench in the round circle, excavated a sondage, a small, narrow trench, which you can just see in the shadow of the slide on the left. This is Dr. Fazeli, myself, and Dr. Manuel trying to identify exactly where the sondage is at the bottom of the trench. Eventually we found it, and this is the sondage, measuring 2 meters by 1 meter, taking us down to the very earliest levels of Sialk at about 16 meters, and a date of close to 6000 BC. We also were interested in more about the layout of the slightly later occupation. So looking at his report from Sialk north of the buttresses and the recesses, we worked on Trench 7 with a rather fine buttressed building with red pigment. And indeed, it has some parallels, perhaps, with the painted building at Zage, in a way not quite so unique, perhaps. And then at this point, I will hand over to Armineh, who's been focusing not just on the chronology, but also on the ceramic analysis, seeing to what extent there is continuity on contrast. So.
First of all, I should apologize in advance because it's going to be very brief, but the subject is very broad. As you may know, with other presentation, Grishman has divided the Tepe to the 2 main phases, considering the color of the pottery. And after that, he decided to divide the Sialk 1 period to the 5 sub-phases based on just decoration. We wanted to know about why he decided to divide that pottery. We started analysis more scientific examination for identify what's the difference between these sub-phases. But unfortunately, we want no evidence of any differences in clay sources or any difference in low temperature, any differences, anything, and all of the sub-phases belongs to the one group. And they are all fired in very low temperature. Other analysis we used is using phylogenetic analysis that gave us the opportunity to illustrate the existing of cultural interaction of pottery across the central plateau. For that, I have compared details of decorative characters of pottery of Sialk with Pardis and Ibrahimabad. And it became apparent that Pardis, Sialk, and Ibrahimabad pottery type 1 are very similar with each other, but they have no evidence of the similarity with Sialk 2. And you can see the chart on the slides. The last and the more interesting thing I would like to point out is that we found two types of red color ceramic in the Sialk that Grishman didn't mention. We have one type of pottery, as you can see. They are red on the surface, but buff in the core. But another type is red in the surface and the core. And when we analyze that two types of pottery, we identified that type 1 red pottery, it's very similar in mineralogical and chemical. They are very similar with Sialk 1 type of pottery. And the only differences is they use very fine iron oxide for like a slip on the both surfaces. But the other type of red pottery, they are dramatically different from this type of pottery. And they are fired in a higher temperature, and the sources of the clay and the composition and everything is very different of the, this type of pottery. Thank you.
So the two sets of chronologies from Sialk North and South have a gap between the two sites, a gap of some 800 years. And Dr. Nokande was talking about Trench B here between the two sites. During 2009, we had the opportunity of bringing out Professor Simpson from Stirling University, who undertook a series of thin sections. Here are some of the rather beautiful thin sections that were analyzed. And they've begun to help us understand the chronology for these areas, as well as key elements about occupation. And what is clear is even after Sialk North is abandoned as a nucleated settlement, actually there is still occupation in that area. It's just no longer nucleated. And also from Sialk North at the very bottom, he's found evidence of early stabling, evidence of burnt dung, identifying perhaps herding being a major role, as we've also heard from some of the earlier presentations. So in terms of Sialk North's origins, Trench 1 has given us very clearly a 15-meter deep sequence dating back to presumably about 6000 BC. And going from an alluvial plain into a nucleated settlement with burnt material evidence of herding. Trench B in between has given us evidence of herding as well on the peripheries, as well as an irrigation channel, evidence of an irrigation channel, which reinforces that evidence from Pardis. But also allowing us to recognize that there is a major climatic shift, 5,500 to about 4,000, and the choices that were open. More on that we really don't know until additional work is conducted. As we've heard earlier, actually what is critical, and this is Hingami El-Kane working on the flotation, is actually understanding the background, as we've heard from the presentation earlier, the background for the environmental context of Sialk, and also how it fits into, as Roger Matthews and Hassan Fazeli have followed Alistair Whittle, saying this series of beginnings for the Neolithic, and how the little star for Sialk actually fits into the broader picture. And one might begin to focus actually on how some hunter-gatherer communities actually withstood the advance of the Neolithic into a later period. So in terms of pushing Sialk down, now we can be sure of the origins of Sialk in 6000 BC, but actually the earlier period we'd be just beginning to understand, as we heard from the presentation earlier. What is clear is if you look at Grishman's writings about the oasis dispersed over difficult country, population being sparse and scattered, actually where we have early occupation, it seems to be associated with water resources, whether it's Cheshmeh Ali with the rugs being washed on the top right, Pardis with the channel, Muffinabad with this water channel, or indeed at Sialk. It seems to be the location at these water systems which is critical. The work we did in 2008 and 2009 was just one step on the contribution from the other presentations and the other studies. If we are to stop the wave of advance of buildings across the site, actually education, community engagement, and also a demonstration of the research to people must be the way forward. So thank you very much again, and I'm very grateful to my two co-authors with this paper, and also for the team who worked at Tappeh Sialk. Thank you very much.